Hello and welcome to TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya and you're watching Eastern Express. If you listen to the Kremlin, Russia is advancing everywhere. The strategic initiative is firmly in its hands. Ukrainian lines are collapsing. Victory is only a matter of time. But when you strip away the rhetoric and look at the data, casualties, meters gained per day, territory seized, economic output, a very different picture emerges. Now, this isn't a lightning war. It's a grinding war of attrition in which Russia is paying an extraordinary price for remarkably limited gains. That's why on this episode of Eastern Express, we'll be looking at the state of the Russian army as we are firmly in the fifth war of Moscow's invasion. And here's a look at our latest report.
Over 4 years into Moscow's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, a Russian victory seems increasingly unlikely. Russia's territorial gains appear modest, despite heavy battlefield losses. Estimates from the Center for Strategic and International Studies place Russia's casualty count at around 1.2 million since the beginning of the war. All the while, questions arise as to why one of the world's supposedly most powerful militaries is recently making such meager gains in Ukraine. Analysts argue that Russia's initial failure in the early days of the war was advancing on too many axes, as well as the overextension of supply lines. This in turn left Moscow's forward troops vulnerable and needing to withdraw. By early 2024, Russia embarked on another offensive against Ukraine's eastern regions. To attract fresh recruits, the Kremlin pursued a policy of high sign-on bonuses for men from Russia's poorest regions. Despite high recruitment, Moscow's eastern offensive has represented the death of hundreds of thousands of young men, only for the Kremlin to capture an additional 0.8% of Ukraine's territory in 2025. Meanwhile, Ukraine has fortified a defensive line to protect strategically important eastern cities, including Kostiantynivka, Druzhkivka, Kramatorsk, and Slovyansk. Analysts also point to the fact that Russian troops are easily spotted and killed in these frontline areas, making large-scale and fast-moving offensives more difficult. Instead, Russian advances are often forced to rely on small-scale infiltrations, accounting for Moscow's limited territorial gains. According to Ukraine's general staff, Ukrainian forces are also carrying out offensive operations in the area where the Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia regions converge. The offensive reclaimed more territory in February 2026 than Russia managed to capture, and according to Kyiv, has inflicted heavy Russian casualties. As Russia's war against Ukraine enters its fifth year, experts say that a Russian victory is far from inevitable. For all of the Kremlin's supposed might, Russian troops continue to die en masse for limited territorial gains.
And now let's zone in on the east-planing portion of our show. Russia's war of attrition has surprised many, who have pointed to the much larger size of the Russian armed forces compared to Ukraine's. And even as Ukraine's armed forces have grown since 2022, Moscow still maintains a larger military. Let's take a closer look at the military imbalance between Russia and Ukraine and why that hasn't led to an immediate Russian victory in Ukraine.
In 2022, the Kremlin had approximately 850,000 active personnel in its ground forces. This compared to Ukraine's roughly 200,000 active ground forces. By 2025, however, Ukraine had amassed nearly 900,000 active soldiers compared to Moscow's approximately 1.32 million active soldiers in 2025. Despite this, experts point to Ukraine's technological innovation as one reason Kyiv has been able to hold many areas of the front line. On Monday, Kyiv touted an interception rate of around 90% against Russia's Shahed-style drones used in attacks against Ukraine's military and civilian populations. In fact, Ukraine's interception capability is so large that Kyiv recently offered to support Gulf states in intercepting Iranian drone strikes in exchange for partners supporting ceasefire efforts in Ukraine. Despite maintaining a larger military than Ukraine, the Kremlin is also fighting Kyiv's technological innovation on the front line. While its war against Ukraine drags on, Russia continues to bleed resources and lose troops.
And now let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. In December 2025, speaking at Russia's National Defense Control Center, President Vladimir Putin declared that Russian troops were advancing, quote, with confidence, and that the strategic initiative lay firmly in Moscow's hands. Variations of this message have been echoed not only on Russian state television, but even by some policymakers in Washington, who argue that Russia's size alone guarantees eventual victory. Size, however, does not automatically translate into success, particularly in a war of attrition. Since February 2022, Russian forces have suffered nearly 1.2 million casualties. Now that includes killed, wounded, and missing. No major power has endured losses on this scale in any war since World War II. In 2025 alone, Russia is estimated to have suffered roughly 415,000 casualties, averaging around 35,000 per month. Ukrainian losses are also severe, between 500,000 and 600,000 casualties, but Russian losses likely exceed them by roughly a 2-to-1 ratio. Now, that's not the profile of a clean, decisive campaign, and the Kremlin's objectives have been clear. Putin seeks to bring Ukraine back into Russia's sphere of influence, either through outright conquest and annexation or by installing a compliant government in Kyiv. He also seeks to halt NATO's eastward expansion. The intellectual foundation for this objective was laid out in his 2021 essay denying the legitimacy of Ukrainian nationhood. When a rapid seizure of Kyiv failed in 2022, Moscow shifted from maneuver warfare to attrition warfare. It emphasizes grinding down the opponent through the systematic destruction of both war machines and personnel. It's inherently costly, and Russia's rate of advance illustrates just how costly. Economically, Russia has not collapsed, but it is under strain. Growth slowed to 0.6% in 2025. Manufacturing contracted for 7 consecutive months, inflation remains elevated, consumer demand is weakening, and labor shortages are acute. Now, to sustain the war, Moscow has leaned heavily on Beijing. Bilateral trade with China reached nearly $250 billion in 2024. China now accounts for roughly 1/3 of Russia's foreign trade and supplies critical dual-use components, microchips, machine tools, drone parts, and missile fuel inputs that underpin Russia's defense production. This partnership mitigates sanctions pressure, but it also underscores Russia's growing asymmetry with China. Demographically, the outlook is bleak. Russia faces a shrinking and aging population, high mortality among working-age men, and sustained emigration of skilled professionals. The return of tens of thousands of veterans, many with combat trauma, poses additional social risks. Now, without additional pressure, the Kremlin can continue to grind forward, however slowly. With coordinated economic and military leverage, Russia's vulnerabilities, its strained economy, and staggering casualty rates become far more consequential. The war in Ukraine is a story of exhaustion, industrial attrition, and the limits of power in the 21st century. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Program at Chatham House. Keir, so glad to have you here with us on Eastern Express. Let me get straight into it. So now, Russia's territorial gains, as we've been seeing here with the numbers, have been modest compared to its ultimate goals, with only a fraction of Ukraine actually seized in recent years despite massive resource commitment. Now, what does this actually say about the effectiveness of Russia's military strategy? In particular, my most important question to you to simplify this is the Russian army in crisis?
Well, when we're thinking about Russian military strategy, we have to bear in mind that Russia has cycled through a number of different strategies trying to win this war and failing. Of course, going into the war under a false assumption that they would be able to walk into Ukraine without resistance was the first thing that upended all of their strategic plans for engaging in a conflict with Ukraine that they weren't even expecting to have to fight. But since then, we've seen Russia fall back on its old-fashioned comfort zone of treating human beings as the most disposable commodity in the military and using people to soak up Ukrainian bullets. And there's been a combination of that approach by Russia and the fact that now new technology is making the battlefield completely transparent to transform the way wars are fought. And in effect, you have a stalemate on the battlefield where there's a dead zone of 15 kilometers, we're quoted, from each side of the front line, where nothing can move without being observed by drones and therefore targeted. You can see the impact of that in the way that Ukraine itself has fought back and recaptured a small amount of territory after Russia's access to Starlink services was turned off when they were effectively blinded on some portions of the front. So it's that transparency, that surveillance, that means very little can move on this front line, and that's one of the reasons why it's remained so static for the last few years.
I hear you did mention a stalemate. I want to ask you this. Do you think, how much does the actual dependency on external factors such as, Western sanctions, economic isolation, and foreign military aid to Ukraine actually shape the current stalemate?
It decides everything. We've known for a long time that this is not a war that is going to be won on the front lines. Instead, it's a test of strength, not just between Ukraine and Russia, but also between the coalitions that are backing each of those sides. We've seen Russia targeting Ukrainian civilian resilience by trying to freeze people over the winter, by destroying their infrastructure, by destroying the power supplies that keep them warm and in the light. And at the same time, we've seen Russia itself exhaust itself and permanently damage its economy by trying to pursue this war, but with the support of the coalition backing it. China, up until recently Iran, North Korea, all of those have kept Russia in the fight. So it is really a political contest between those two opposing blocs, those two opposing coalitions, that will decide the future fate of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. So now, Kerry, you did just mention that, Russia's economy is under strain. So now, with you saying that, then how sustainable is Moscow's war effort if its economy continues to weaken?
A lot of people are very optimistically looking forward to a period when Russia's economy finally falls over, finally collapses, and that means the end of fighting. Sadly, it's not going to be quite as simple as that. First, there isn't a direct link between an economic collapse and the end of the war. We've seen plenty of examples where soldiers have fought on long after they stopped getting paid. And also, of course, all of the optimistic forecasts of when this would happen to Russia have turned out to be misguided so far. In part, that's because Russia can draw on such great reserves of foreign currency and is so willing to damage the long-term prospects of its economy to turn it into a war economy. But also, of course, it's because of the ongoing support that Russia receives, not just from its coalition partners, but also from the income that it brings in through energy exports, for instance, using the Shadow Fleet. So all of these have kept Russia in the fight longer than it had any right to be.
Let me ask you, if we look at the numbers, there's been a lot of talk, of course, if we look at the numbers in total, right, since the beginning of this war. Russian battlefield casualties and fatalities are significantly, reportedly, greater than Ukrainian casualties and fatalities. Can you tell us a little bit about that in detail?
It's true. The casualty figures have fluctuated over time, of course, and there have been periods when Russia was able to recruit more people than it was losing on the battlefield, other periods when it had a manpower deficit. But the underlying truth of it all is that Ukraine spares its people, and Russia does not, but Ukraine has to, because it is under greater demographic pressure than Russia is. Russia can continue to drain its manpower sump, can continue to call up the ethnic minorities, bring in people from overseas who are sometimes duped into signing up with the Russian armed forces, and throw them into the front line to soak up Ukrainian bullets. Ukraine, meanwhile, has to look after its very fragile demographic future. So yes, there is a huge disproportion in terms of the numbers of casualties that each side is suffering, but Russia can afford it much better than Ukraine can.
But let me ask you this, Kira. doesn't the Russian population understand this? I understand that propaganda plays a big role here, not just in Moscow, but all over Russia. But what do Russia's citizens, think about this? They know that their own soldiers are dying, yet somehow, Russian propaganda is trying to hide this number and the broader picture. What can you say about this?
Well, Russian media not only try to hide the broader picture, but they actually succeed. And part of the reason for that is Russia saw this as a key vulnerability, not just in 2022, but right at the outset of the war on Ukraine in 2014. The Russian leadership understood how reporting on casualty figures in previous wars in Afghanistan and in Chechnya had been a serious problem for them, because people understand just what the human cost of the war is. So they moved very early to suppress that information, make sure that organizations which worked with soldiers, for example, couldn't pool that information, couldn't spread the knowledge about just how much the war was costing people. As a result, yes, you don't get a clear picture of exactly what the human casualties are if you're inside Russia.
Yet they somehow claim that Ukrainian casualties are most likely much higher than Russia's. Kira, let me ask you this. Do you think that Ukraine's use of drones and precise targeting right now has increased Russian casualties relative to wounded, forcing a slower Russian tempo? Now, my question to you is, do you think that defensive technologies like drones are actually giving Ukraine a decisive advantage?
The advantage comes and goes. It's a technological race where any temporary advantage that one side might have is swiftly countered. Whether it is drone navigation, whether it is electronic warfare suppressing them, all of these things are in a constant battle. And that's one of the reasons why that front line in Ukraine has developed so far beyond what a lot of Western militaries that are themselves preparing for conflict are actually ready to understand. It's a very different picture on that front line than a lot of the wars that Western militaries have been practicing for.
All right, Keir, some intelligence estimates suggest that Russia's offensive has stalled partly due to political calculations, avoiding major moves to not provoke even more Western responses. How much is Russia actually holding back because of fear of Western reactions versus military fatigue? And let me ask you this, and now what's been playing in lately for the past 6 days is this new conflict that has just erupted in Iran, right? And Iran, of course, being very friendly and quite an ally to Moscow. How is that shaping up?
Well, for Russia, of course, it's a mixed picture because on the one hand, yes, they will be dismayed that another of their allies and partners has fallen out of this coalition because it is occupied with being attacked itself. But on the other hand, Russia had already gained most of the benefit in terms of boosting its own war machine from Iran that it needed. The Iranian technology that was supplied to Russia has already been developed and run out on a much greater scale within Russia itself. And there is some suggestion that Russia is actually supplying drones back to Iran to engage in its own offensive. And of course, all of this has an impact on oil prices, and it is oil prices which drive the Russian economy. So while on the one hand they will be concerned that they are losing a friend, on the other hand they do reap material benefits from the situation overall, particularly if it distracts any support from Ukraine or it uses up those limited stocks of air defense munitions that were supposed to be earmarked for Kyiv.
Do you think that Russia's heavy losses actually strengthen Ukraine's resolve and international support?
The heavy losses that are suffered by Russia don't deter Russia itself, and in fact are an indication sometimes that all of that support for Ukraine comes into question because people think, well, since Ukraine is doing so much damage to Russia, does it really make sense that Russia could be a threat to anywhere else? So once again, it's a mixed picture. Everybody understands that Russia is careless with the lives of its soldiery, but the extent to which that fact helps Ukraine is limited.
And let me ask you this. I mean, we did talk a little bit earlier about, what's actually happening and being told inside Russia. But let me ask you this point. I mean, particularly now, as you mentioned, we have this war in Iran, right? And, Russia is now losing yet another ally, as you mentioned. But do you think the domestic pressures could actually force another strategic shift in Russian policy?
It's unlikely that any domestic pressure will change Russian policy. One of the things that Russia did in preparation for this war, when it changed strategic gear in the middle of 2021, was to make sure that they could move from controlling domestic opposition to eliminating it altogether. People know that it is a poor life choice to speak up against the leadership, to speak up against the war, and they will be punished for doing it. So unless and until domestic dissent and domestic unhappiness with the standard of living in Russia, with the number of casualties that become undeniable, gets to a point where people are actually ready to openly protest, we won't see any bottom-up change in Russia's policy.
And just very briefly, Keir, do you think really that international sanctions are actually changing Russia's military decisions?
Yes, they are changing Russia's military decisions, not in the headline way that people think of, that the punishment from sanctions will force the economic pain that would bring Russia to change its policy overall, but the sanctions that are designed to impede Russia's military regeneration and the technology that it uses for its armed forces. Those have been effective over time in the same way that the targeted sanctions against Russia's energy industry have curtailed Russia's ability to make money. But, of course, they are incomplete without an enforcement regime and without the flexibility to deal with evasion.
Thank you so much, Keir Giles, a Senior Consulting Fellow at the Russia and Eurasia Program, Chatham House, for being with us here on Eastern Express.
Thank you.
And we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you don't want to miss. Vladimir Putin hosted Hungarian Foreign Minister Péter Szijjártó in Moscow on March 4. The talks touched on disrupted oil supplies through the Druzhba pipeline, a key energy route for Hungary and Slovakia.
The southern branch of the pipeline, which runs through Ukraine, has been offline since late January. Kyiv says that the halt followed a Russian strike, while Budapest and Bratislava accuse Ukraine of deliberately withholding supplies. The route previously covered up to 90% of Hungary's and most of Slovakia's crude oil imports. During this meeting with Sciarto, Putin agreed to release 2 prisoners of war with dual Hungarian and Ukrainian citizenship.
Russia's prison population has fallen to a historic low, according to Kremlin officials. Now, the announcement comes after years of large-scale recruitment of inmates to fight in Ukraine.
Moscow says 308,000 people are currently incarcerated nationwide, down from 1.06 million in 2001. The Kremlin attributes the decline to the so-called humanization of Russia's law enforcement system under Vladimir Putin. However, analysts say that the sharp drop is closely linked to prisoner conscription since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Ukrainian intelligence previously estimated that between 140 to 180,000 Russian prisoners have been enlisted as of late 2024. Russian authorities, however, no longer publish detailed prison statistics.
Open fighting has erupted between Pakistan and Afghanistan, marking a sharp escalation along their 1,600-mile border. The clashes threaten to derail Central Asia's ambitions to expand trade routes through the 2 countries to global markets.
Starting early this week, Pakistan carried out airstrikes near Bagram Air Base, once a hub of U.S. operations during the war in Afghanistan. Taliban officials say they responded with counterstrikes, and ground firefights have been reported across the frontier. Both sides are claiming heavy casualties, while Kabul is accusing Islamabad of killing civilians. The violence comes after months of diplomatic outreach by Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan, which have sought closer trade ties with both Islamabad and Kabul. Regional analysts say the conflict risks freezing these initiatives.
And that's all for this episode of Eastern Express here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. I'll see you next time.